You're sitting in a movie theater, watching one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses deliver a performance that seems effortless, natural, completely in the moment. The quirky mannerisms, that signature style, the way she makes you laugh and cry in the same breath. Now imagine that behind those iconic glasses and that brilliant smile, there's a battle raging that no one in the audience can see. A battle that's stealing memories, erasing years of experiences, and slowly dimming one of cinema's brightest lights. What if I told you that Diane Keaton, the woman who gave us Annie Hall, who made us believe in neurotic love stories and unconventional beauty, who defined what it meant to be authentically yourself on screen, was fighting a secret war, a war she watched her own mother lose over 15 agonizing years, a war that eventually came for her too. This isn't just another celebrity health story. This is about legacy, genetics, silence, and the cruel irony of an actress who spent her life creating unforgettable moments while slowly losing the ability to remember them. Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover changes everything you thought you knew about Diane Keaton's final years. The news broke like a thunderclap across Hollywood and beyond. On October 11, 2025, Diane Keaton passed away at the age of 79. The official cause of death listed on her death certificate was primary bacterial pneumonia, a respiratory infection that, while serious, seemed almost routine for someone of advanced age. Her family released a statement thanking fans for their support, and the entertainment world mourned the loss of an icon who had graced our screens for more than 5 decades. Tributes poured in from co-stars, directors, and millions of fans who had grown up watching her transform from the wide-eyed dreamer in The Godfather to the sophisticated romantic lead who could hold her own opposite Jack Nicholson, Keanu Reeves, and Diane Keaton's longtime collaborator and former partner, Al Pacino. But then, just days after her passing, a different story began to emerge from sources close to the actress, a story that had been carefully guarded, protected by those who loved her, and hidden from the public eye for years. According to exclusive reports from News Nation and multiple entertainment insiders, Diane Keaton hadn't just been battling pneumonia in her final days. She had been waging a much longer, much more devastating fight against dementia and Alzheimer's disease, conditions that had been quietly stealing pieces of her brilliant mind for years before her death. One source told News Nation directly she was battling for years. Another insider familiar with Keaton's final film projects revealed something even more striking. During the filming of her 2023 romantic comedy Maybe I Do, which was actually shot in 2022, Keaton's memory had deteriorated so significantly that she allegedly needed to wear an earpiece on set, an assistive device that would feed her lines because she was struggling to remember them on her own. Think about that for a moment. This was Diane Keaton, an Academy Award-winning actress with decades of experience. Someone who had memorized countless scripts, delivered thousands of lines, created characters that lived in our collective consciousness, and now she needed technological assistance just to get through her scenes. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the entertainment industry and the millions of people who have watched loved ones struggle with similar cognitive decline. But here's where the story becomes even more profound, even more heartbreaking, and in some ways, even more inevitable. This wasn't Diane Keaton's first encounter with dementia. In fact, she had written extensively about watching this exact disease destroy someone she loved more than anyone else in the world, her mother, Dorothy Diane Keaton Hall. And in doing so, she had unknowingly documented the genetic shadow that would eventually overtake her own life. Let me take you back to 2011, when Diane Keaton published a deeply personal memoir titled Then Again. This wasn't your typical celebrity autobiography filled with glamorous anecdotes and name-dropping. Instead, Keaton crafted something far more intimate and devastating. She intertwined her own journal entries with those of her mother, creating a dual narrative that explored their relationship, their dreams, their disappointments, and ultimately, Dorothy's heartbreaking 15-year battle with Alzheimer's disease. The book opened with a simple, powerful statement about her mother. Mom liked to think. Those 4 words carried so much weight because they described exactly what Alzheimer's would eventually steal from Dorothy: her ability to think, to reason, to remember, to recognize even her own daughter. Dorothy Diane first learned of her diagnosis in June 1993, and she recorded the moment in her journal with devastating clarity. This is the day I heard I have the beginning of Alzheimer's disease. Scary, That single word, scary, captured the terror of knowing what was coming, of understanding that her mind, her memories, her very identity would slowly be erased. And for the next 15 years, Dorothy fought. She kept writing in her journals even as the disease progressed, documenting her frustrations, her fears, her moments of clarity and confusion. Diane Keaton preserved these entries, treasured them, and eventually shared it with the world as both a tribute to her mother and a raw, honest look at what Alzheimer's does to families. And then again, Keaton wrote about the progressive loss with poetic heartbreak. Goodbye to names of places. Goodbye to recognizing me as her daughter. Can you imagine? The woman who gave you life, who raised you, who knew every detail of your childhood, suddenly looking at you with blank eyes, no recognition, no connection. Toward the end of Dorothy's life, Keaton described how her mother would forcefully say no to things like taking pills, being repositioned in bed, or accepting care from nurses. It was one of the few words Dorothy could still access, a last desperate assertion of autonomy, as everything else slipped away. Dorothy Deanne died in 2008 at the age of 86, her mind having been slowly dismantled over a decade and a half. Diane Keaton had been there for all of it, watching, caring, writing, trying to hold on to every memory of her mother, even as her mother lost every memory of her. Here's what makes this story so crucial to understanding what happened to Diane Keaton herself. Alzheimer's disease and dementia can run in families. While the vast majority of Alzheimer's cases, more than 99%, are not directly inherited in a simple genetic pattern, having a parent with the disease significantly increases your risk. Researchers have identified several genes associated with Alzheimer's, with the APO gene being the most significant. Everyone inherits 2 copies of APO, one from their mother and one from their father. There are different variants of this gene, and having even one copy of the E4 variant, known as APO E4, can double or triple a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's. Having 2 copies, one from each parent, increases that risk exponentially. Beyond specific genes, family history itself is considered the second strongest risk factor for Alzheimer's, right after age. So when Diane Keaton wrote about her mother's battle in 2011, she wasn't just preserving a family history. She was, in a sense, documenting her own potential future. Multiple sources have now confirmed that dementia ran in Keaton's family, creating what geneticists call a hereditary predisposition. This doesn't guarantee that someone will develop the disease, but it stacks the deck against them in ways that can feel almost predestined. Keaton knew this. She had researched it. She had lived through it. And according to those close to her, she spent years worrying about whether she would follow the same path her mother had walked, a path that ended in confusion, loss, and the gradual erasure of self. The signs, when we look back now with this new information, were subtle but present. Keaton had not been seen in public since April 2025, an unusually long absence for someone who had maintained an active presence on social media and in the entertainment world. Her last public appearances had become increasingly rare, and those who saw her noted that something seemed different, though they couldn't quite articulate what had changed. Then there was a situation on the set of Maybe I Do, the film, a romantic comedy that also starred Richard Gere, Susan Sarandon, Emma Roberts, and Luke Bracey, was supposed to be a light, fun project about love and marriage across generations. But behind the scenes, the production faced unexpected challenges related to Keaton's health. According to on-set sources who spoke to media outlets after her death, Keaton's memory issues had progressed to the point where standard filming procedures had to be adapted. The earpiece wasn't just an occasional aid. It became a necessary tool for getting through scenes. Production assistants would feed her lines in real time, allowing Keaton to maintain the appearance of a seamless performance, even though her ability to memorize and recall dialogue had been compromised. This is not uncommon in late-career performances by actors dealing with cognitive decline, but it's usually kept quiet out of respect for performers' dignity and privacy. The fact that Keaton was able to complete the film at all speaks to her professionalism, her determination, and the support of crew that clearly care about protecting her. But using an earpiece for lines is just one adaptation. What it really reveals is the daily struggle Keaton must have been experiencing. Imagine waking up each morning not entirely sure what you did the day before. Imagine reading a script and having the words slip away before you can commit them to memory. Imagine being surrounded by people who expect you to be Diane Keaton, the legend, the icon, the brilliant actress, while inside you're fighting just to hold on to the present moment. This is what dementia does. It doesn't just steal memories of the past. It makes it increasingly difficult to form new memories, to learn new information, to maintain the continuity of experience that we all take for granted. Friends and colleagues of Keaton have described her as someone who became increasingly private in her final years, someone who withdrew from the social scene she once enjoyed, someone who preferred to comfort her home to the chaos of Hollywood events. At the time, many assumed this was simply a natural evolution, an aging actress choosing peace and privacy over publicity. But now, with the revelation of her dementia diagnosis, those choices take on new meaning. Withdrawal from social situations is a common response to cognitive decline. People become aware that they're struggling to follow conversations, to remember names, to keep track of the flow of events. Rather than risk embarrassment or having their condition exposed, they retreat into smaller, more controlled environments where the demands on their memory and processing are reduced. Keaton's longtime friend, journalist Paula Froelich, was one of the first to publicly discuss the actress's secret battle after her death. Froelich stated that Keaton had been fighting dementia for the past couple years and that Alzheimer's had played a significant role in her decline, even though pneumonia was listed as the immediate cause of death on her death certificate. This is actually quite common with dementia patients. While the disease itself is ravaging the brain, it also weakens the immune system and makes the body more vulnerable to infections like pneumonia. In medical terms, the pneumonia might be what ultimately stops the heart and lungs, but the underlying condition, the dementia, is what created a pathway for that final infection to take hold. In Keaton's case, according to Froelich and other sources, the dementia had been progressing for years, though Keaton and those closest to her had managed to keep it largely hidden from public view. This level of privacy protection is remarkable in our current age of constant surveillance and social media exposure. It suggests that Keaton had a tight circle of trusted individuals who understood the importance of allowing her to maintain her dignity as the disease progressed. But it also raises questions about what we as a society owe to public figures who are suffering. Do we have a right to know about their health struggles? Or do they have a right to face those struggles in private, without the added burden of public scrutiny and speculation? There's no easy answer. But what we can say is that Keaton's choice to keep her diagnosis private was consistent with her personality and her values. Throughout her career, despite being one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, Keaton maintained firm boundaries around her personal life. She never married, though she had high-profile relationships with Woody Allen, Warren Beatty, and Al Pacino. She adopted 2 children as a single mother and raised them largely out of the spotlight. She was open about certain struggles, like her battles with bulimia, an eating disorder she wrote about extensively in her memoirs, and her multiple encounters with skin cancer, which she discussed publicly to raise awareness about sun damage and the importance of regular screenings. But when it came to her cognitive decline, she chose silence, perhaps because she had already lived through it once with her mother and knew how brutal, how undignified, how utterly consuming the public documentation of such a decline could be. Let's talk about what dementia and Alzheimer's actually do to a person, because understanding the disease helps us understand the magnitude of what Keaton was facing. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, accounting for 60 to 80% of cases. It's a progressive neurodegenerative disorder, which means it gets worse over time and involves the death of brain cells. The disease typically begins with mild memory loss, often dismissed as normal aging. You forget where you put your keys. You lose track of appointments. You struggle to find the right word in conversation. But then it progresses. The memory problems become more severe. You forget recent events entirely. You get lost in familiar places. You have trouble with language, not just finding words, but understanding what others are saying to you. As Alzheimer's advances into its moderate stage, the symptoms expand beyond memory. Personality changes emerge. Someone who was always calm might become agitated or aggressive. Someone who was social might become withdrawn and suspicious. There are problems with impulse control, with judgment, with recognizing faces, even faces of people you've known your entire life. This is a stage where Dorothy Diane stopped recognizing her daughter. This is a stage where a person might need constant supervision because they can't safely perform basic tasks like cooking or bathing. And then comes a severe stage, the final chapter. At this point, individuals lose the ability to communicate coherently. They need help with all aspects of personal care. They may lose the ability to walk, to sit up, to swallow. The brain has deteriorated so extensively that it can no longer control even the most basic bodily functions. And eventually, as the brain loses its ability to coordinate essential systems, the body becomes vulnerable to infections, particularly pneumonia, which is what many Alzheimer's patients ultimately die from, just as Diane Keaton did. The timeline of Alzheimer's varies dramatically from person to person. Some people progress through the stages relatively quickly, over 4 to 8 years. Others, like Dorothy Diane, might live with the disease for 15 years or more. But what's universal is a relentless, irreversible nature to the decline. There's currently no cure for Alzheimer's disease. There are medications that can temporarily slow the progression or ease some symptoms, particularly in the early stages, but they cannot stop or reverse the underlying brain damage. This means that from the moment of diagnosis, patients and their families are facing a future of loss, a gradual goodbye that can stretch on for years. For someone like Diane Keaton, who built her career and her identity around her ability to think creatively, to remember lines, to understand complex characters, to connect emotionally with audiences, the prospect of losing those cognitive abilities must have been terrifying. Her mother's experience gave her a roadmap of what to expect, but that knowledge likely made things worse, not better. She knew what was coming. She knew there would be no dramatic recovery, no third-act twist where everything gets better, just decline, confusion, and eventually the same kind of ending her mother had faced. The hereditary aspect of Keaton's case adds another layer of tragedy and also serves as an important public health message. While most Alzheimer's is not caused by a single genetic mutation, family history matters enormously. If you have a parent or sibling with Alzheimer's, your risk of developing the disease is higher than someone with no family history. This risk increases even more if multiple family members have been affected or if the disease appeared at a relatively young age in those relatives. Researchers are still working to understand exactly how genetic factors interact with environmental and lifestyle factors to trigger Alzheimer's. But what's clear is that genetics load the gun, even if other factors pull the trigger. For people who have watched a parent suffer from Alzheimer's, the fear of inheritance can be overwhelming. Many choose not to pursue genetic testing because they'd rather not know if they carry high-risk variants of genes like APOE4. After all, what would you do with that information? There's no proven prevention, no way to guarantee you won't develop the disease, even if you have favorable genetics. So some people prefer to live without the shadow of genetic predetermination hanging over them. Others want to know, feeling that knowledge empowers them to make informed decisions about their health, their care planning, and their futures. We don't know whether Diane Keaton ever pursued genetic testing for Alzheimer's risk, but given her intimate experience with the disease through her mother, it seems likely she had at least considered it. What we do know is that Keaton was acutely aware of the possibility that she might develop Alzheimer's. In interviews following the publication of Then Again, she spoke about her fears regarding her own cognitive health. She talked about trying to stay mentally active, about the importance of continuing to challenge herself creatively, about hoping that her work as an actress, photographer, and writer might serve as a form of cognitive protection. There's some scientific support for this idea. Studies have shown that people who engage in mentally stimulating activities throughout their lives, particularly activities that involve learning new skills or processing complex information, may have some reduced risk of dementia or may experience symptoms later than those who don't engage in such activities. But it's not a guarantee, and for someone with strong genetic risk factors, it might not be enough. The silence around Keaton's diagnosis until after her death also speaks to broader issues of stigma and shame associated with dementia. Despite being one of the most common and devastating conditions affecting older adults, dementia still carries significant social stigma. People are afraid of being seen as less competent, less intelligent, less worthy of respect once they receive a diagnosis. They worry about being dismissed, patronized, or treated as though they've already lost their personhood, even while they're still very much present and aware. This stigma affects not just how patients are treated, but also whether they seek diagnosis and support in the first place. Many people with early dementia symptoms avoid going to doctors, avoid getting tested, avoid acknowledging what's happening because they're terrified of the label and what it might mean for their relationships, their independence, and their sense of self. For a public figure like Diane Keaton, the stakes of disclosure were even higher. Her entire professional value was tied to her cognitive abilities, her talent, her capacity to perform. Revealing a dementia diagnosis could have meant the end of job offers, the end of being taken seriously in creative discussions, the end of being seen as Diane Keaton the artist, and the beginning of being seen only as Diane Keaton the patient. So she, like many others in similar positions, chose privacy. She chose to work as long as she could, to maintain her dignity, to control her narrative, and ultimately, she chose to let the truth emerge only after she was gone, when it could no longer hurt her career or expose her to unwanted scrutiny. But here's the thing about secrecy. It prevents conversation. It prevents other people who are struggling with similar situations from seeing examples of how to handle them. It perpetuates the idea that dementia is something shameful that should be hidden rather than a medical condition that deserves compassion, research funding, and public support. Now that Keaton's story has been revealed, it has the potential to open up these conversations, to make people think about their own family histories, their own risk factors, their own plans for how they would handle a similar diagnosis. Consider the broader context of Alzheimer's and dementia in our society. Currently, more than 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and that number is expected to rise dramatically as the population ages. By 2050, unless we find effective prevention or treatment strategies, that number could reach nearly 13 million. The disease doesn't just affect patients. It affects families, caregivers, communities, and healthcare systems. Family members providing unpaid care for loved ones with dementia contribute billions of hours and incalculable emotional labor. Many caregivers experience depression, anxiety, physical health problems, and financial strain as they try to balance the demands of care with the rest of their lives. Diane Keaton understood this intimately from her experience caring for her mother, and it's likely she thought about the burden her own diagnosis might place on her children and close friends. The financial costs of dementia care are staggering as well. Between medical expenses, long-term care, hospice services, and the indirect costs of lost productivity from patients and caregivers, Alzheimer's disease costs the United States hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And unlike many other major health conditions, there's been relatively less progress in finding effective treatments. We've made enormous strides in cancer treatment, heart disease, HIV/AIDS, but Alzheimer's remains stubbornly resistant to intervention. Dozens of promising drugs have failed in clinical trials. The few medications that are approved provide only modest, temporary benefits. It's a disease that has frustrated researchers, broken families, and stolen millions of lives over the decades. Diane Keaton's death from pneumonia, while directly related to a bacterial infection, fits the pattern of how many dementia patients die. As Alzheimer's progresses to severe stages, patients often develop problems with swallowing, which can lead to aspiration, breathing in food, liquid, or saliva into the lungs. This creates ideal conditions for pneumonia to develop. Additionally, advanced dementia patients are often bedridden or have limited mobility, which increases pneumonia risk. Their weakened immune systems, poor nutrition, and the overall toll the disease has taken on their bodies make it difficult to fight off infections that a healthy person might easily overcome. So while the death certificate might say pneumonia, everyone who understands dementia knows that Alzheimer's was the underlying cause, the condition that made pneumonia possible and ultimately fatal. Let's return to the timeline of Keaton's final years and months. According to reports, her health declined particularly sharply in the months leading up to her death. People magazine reported that sources close to Keaton noted her health had deteriorated very suddenly in recent months, which is sometimes a pattern with late-stage dementia. A person can seem relatively stable, functioning at a certain level, and then experience a rapid decline triggered by an infection, a fall, a medication change, or sometimes no identifiable cause at all. It's as if the body and brain have been holding on by sheer force of will, and then suddenly they can't anymore. Keaton reportedly listed her dream home for sale, suggesting that either she or those managing her affairs recognized that she would no longer be able to live independently in that space. The revelation that Keaton needed an earpiece during the filming of Maybe I Do is particularly poignant when you consider what that film was about. The movie explores themes of love, marriage, commitment, and the question of whether it's ever too late to find happiness or make meaningful connections. Here was Diane Keaton, in what would turn out to be one of her final film roles, exploring questions of aging and relationships while privately battling a disease that was literally disconnecting her from her own experiences and memories. There's a profound irony there, one that speaks to the disconnect between the personas actors create on screen and the realities they face off camera. It's worth noting that Keaton's experience is not unique among actors. Many performers have continued working well into the progression of dementia, sometimes with support crews who help them manage, sometimes without anyone on set realizing what's happening until much later. There have been cases of major stars who needed special accommodations, whether cue cards placed around the set, constant prompting from directors, or increasingly supportive editing in post-production to make performances work. The entertainment industry, despite its often cutthroat reputation, can also be remarkably protective of its legends, especially when those legends have earned the respect and affection of their colleagues over decades of professional relationships. What makes Keaton's case especially significant is her mother's history. The fact that she had witnessed the full arc of Alzheimer's in someone she loved, that she had documented it in such detail in her memoir, and that she then faced the same diagnosis herself created a narrative that's almost unbearably sad. It's as if she wrote the script for her own ending years before it happened. When she wrote Then Again, she included this passage about her mother. She was someone who loved words, loved ideas, loved thinking about why things were the way they were. She could have been describing herself. And just as Dorothy lost that ability to engage with words and ideas, so too did Diane eventually face the same loss. The question of how long Keaton knew about her diagnosis remains somewhat unclear. Sources say she was battling dementia for years, which suggests she may have received a diagnosis as early as 2020 or 2021, though possibly even earlier. The challenge with dementia is that diagnosis isn't always straightforward. Early symptoms can be subtle and easy to dismiss as normal aging or stress. Many people don't seek evaluation until symptoms become severe enough to interfere with daily life, by which point the disease is already well established. And even when people do seek evaluation, getting a definitive diagnosis can take time and require multiple tests, including cognitive assessments, brain imaging, and sometimes additional procedures to rule out other conditions that can mimic dementia. If Keaton did receive a diagnosis several years before her death, she would have had time to process it, to make plans, to prepare herself and her family. She might have had the opportunity to try some of the available medications that can provide modest cognitive benefits in early-stage Alzheimer's. She could have made decisions about her care preferences, her financial arrangements, her legacy. All of this is speculation, of course, since the details of her medical history remain private. But what we do know is that she continued working as long as she could, which suggests either that her symptoms were relatively manageable for a period or that her determination to maintain her career overrode the challenges she was facing. The decision to keep her diagnosis private was likely influenced by multiple factors. There's the personal preference for privacy, which Keaton had maintained throughout her life regarding many aspects of her health and relationships. There's a professional calculation that revealing a dementia diagnosis might end her career prematurely, costing her work opportunities, and potentially affecting projects already in development. There's a desire to protect her children from public scrutiny and invasive questions about their mother's condition. There's the awareness, gained from her mother's experience, of how quickly a person can be reduced to their diagnosis in the public eye, becoming not Diane Keaton, but Diane Keaton, Alzheimer's patient, with every appearance and interview analyzed for signs of cognitive decline. And perhaps there was also an element of denial or hope. Maybe if she didn't talk about it publicly, if she kept working, if she maintained her routines, the disease might progress more slowly. Maybe she could beat the odds that claimed her mother. This kind of magical thinking is common among people facing terminal or progressive diagnoses. It's a coping mechanism, a way of maintaining psychological equilibrium in the face of terrifying certainty. And who could blame her for wanting to hold on to hope? even hope that might be unfounded, for as long as possible. Now that the information about Keaton's dementia battle has become public, it reframes many of the tributes and memorials that followed her death. Al Pacino, her former partner and co-star in the Godfather films and other projects, released a statement saying he was shaken and deeply saddened by her death, noting that she was my partner, my friend, someone who brought me happiness and on more than one occasion influenced the direction of my life. Knowing now that she had been quietly suffering from dementia adds additional layers of meaning to such tributes. These weren't just colleagues mourning a fellow actor. They were people who had likely known about her struggle, who had perhaps watched her decline, who had been carrying the weight of that knowledge even as the public remained unaware. Goldie Hawn, Keaton's co-star in The First Wives Club, said that Keaton left a trail of fairy dust, filled with particles of light and memories beyond imagination. That reference to memories takes on new poignancy, knowing that Keaton's own memories were being stolen by disease. And the countless fans who posted tributes on social media, sharing their favorite Diane Keaton moments, their favorite quotes from her films, the ways she had touched their lives, were all creating a collective memory, a cultural preservation of who Diane Keaton was, even as her personal memories were fading. This brings us to an important point about legacy and memory. When someone dies from Alzheimer's or dementia, there's often a complicated grief process for those left behind. On one hand, death can bring a sense of relief, an end to suffering, an end to watching a loved one disappear piece by piece. On the other hand, there's a grief for everything that was lost long before death occurred, the conversations that became impossible, the shared memories that could no longer be shared because one person no longer remembered them, the personality changes that made a person seem like a stranger in a familiar body. For Diane Keaton's children, her friends, her colleagues who knew about her condition, they had likely been grieving for years before her actual death, mourning each new loss as her dementia progressed. But for the public, for fans, for people who knew Diane Keaton only through her work, her death came as a single event, and the revelation of her dementia battle came as a posthumous surprise. This creates a strange situation where the public is now retrospectively reinterpreting her final years, looking back at her last appearances and performances with new context, wondering what signs it might have missed, feeling perhaps a sense of sadness that they didn't know, couldn't support her, couldn't properly appreciate what she was going through. This is one of the complications of celebrity illness. The relationship between public figures and their audiences is one-directional in many ways, but fans often feel a deep sense of connection and concern that can't be reciprocated in the same way. What can we learn from Diane Keaton's story? First, it's a stark reminder that dementia doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter how talented you are, how successful, how beloved. Brain disease can strike anyone, and no amount of achievement or acclaim provides protection. Second, it highlights the importance of family history and genetic risk factors. If you have a parent or close relative with Alzheimer's or dementia, that's information worth taking seriously. It doesn't mean you're doomed to the same fate, but it does mean you should discuss it with your healthcare providers, potentially modify lifestyle factors that might influence risk, and think about planning for the possibility of cognitive decline. Third, Keaton's story underscores the need for better research, better treatments, and ultimately a cure for these devastating diseases. The fact that we can send spacecraft to Mars, that we can edit genes, that we've made incredible advances in so many areas of medicine, but we still can't effectively treat or prevent Alzheimer's, is a failure that costs millions of people their memories, their independence, their very selves. More funding, more research, more clinical trials, more innovative approaches are desperately needed. And public awareness, which stories like Keaton's can help generate, is part of building the political and social will to make that research a priority. Fourth, there's the question of how we as a society treat people with dementia. The stigma, the tendency to write people off once they receive a diagnosis, the lack of adequate support systems for patients and caregivers. These are all things we need to address. People with dementia are still people. They still have worth. They still experience emotions. They still deserve dignity and respect. Too often, cognitive decline is treated as a kind of social death that precedes biological death, with patients being excluded from conversations about their own care, being talked over or talked about as if they're not present, being reduced to their symptoms rather than seen as whole human beings who happen to be ill. Finally, Keaton's choice to keep her diagnosis private, while understandable, also reflects a lack of good models for how public figures can navigate these situations. Few celebrities have openly discussed dealing with Alzheimer's or dementia in real time. There are some notable exceptions: actors and musicians who have either disclosed their own diagnoses or been open about family member struggles, but it's still relatively rare compared to the prevalence of the disease. This means each person facing the situation has to make difficult decisions without much precedent or guidance. Should they go public and risk the pitfalls of exposure? Should they stay private and miss the opportunity to raise awareness and perhaps find support? There's no right answer, but the more people who choose to share their stories, the easier it becomes for others to do the same, and the more normalized these conversations become. As we reflect on Diane Keaton's life and legacy, it's important to remember the full scope of who she was. She wasn't just an actress, though she was an extraordinary one, an Academy Award winner, a multiple Golden Globe winner, someone who created indelible characters and unforgettable moments on screen. She was also a photographer, a writer, a mother, a daughter, a friend, someone who was passionate about architecture and design, someone who championed unconventional beauty standards, someone who lived life on her own terms and never quite fit the Hollywood mold. Her battle with dementia was one part of her story, but it shouldn't overshadow everything else she accomplished and meant. At the same time, acknowledging her struggle is important. It's important for the millions of other families dealing with similar situations, who might find some comfort or recognition in knowing that even icons face these battles. It's important for raising awareness about genetic risk factors and the need for better research. It's important for reducing stigma and encouraging honest conversations about cognitive health. And it's important for honoring the fullness of Keaton's experience, including the challenges she faced with courage and grace, even when facing them meant doing so quietly and privately. The fact that Diane Keaton managed to complete film projects, to maintain relationships, to handle the business of her life, even while dealing with progressive dementia, speaks to her strength and determination. It also speaks to the support system around her, the people who helped her manage, who protected her privacy, who allowed her to continue being Diane Keaton as long as possible. Dementia care is not something anyone does alone. It requires a village of medical professionals, family members, friends, and often paid caregivers who together create a network of support that can make the difference between a patient feeling cared for or feeling lost and alone. For those watching loved ones go through similar struggles, Keaton's story might resonate in painful but validating ways. You might see echoes of your own experience in descriptions of her mother Dorothy's 15-year battle, the slow loss of recognition, the way words slip away, the personality changes. You might understand the complicated emotions of trying to be present for someone who is no longer fully present themselves. You might relate to the exhaustion, the grief, the moments of frustration and guilt, the deep love that persists even when the person you're loving can no longer remember who you are. And you might find some comfort in knowing that these experiences, as isolating as they feel, are shared by millions of others going through the same journey. As we close this exploration of Diane Keaton's secret battle with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, we're left with questions as much as answers. How much of her suffering was hereditary, written in her genes from birth? How much might have been preventable or delayable through different interventions? At what point did she realize she was following her mother's path? What was it like for her to film those final scenes, knowing or suspecting that her mind was slipping? Did she find peace with her diagnosis, or did she rage against it? Did she have moments of clarity where she could appreciate her legacy, or were those moments increasingly rare and fragmented? We'll never know the answers to many of these questions, and perhaps that's as it should be. Diane Keaton valued her privacy, and even in death, some aspects of her experience remain hers alone. What we can do is honor her memory by acknowledging the full truth of her life, including its painful chapters. We can use her story as a catalyst for important conversations about brain health, genetic risk, caregiving, and the need for better medical solutions. We can remember her not just as the quirky, brilliant actress who made us laugh and cry, but also as a person who faced one of life's cruelest diseases with the same authenticity and grace she brought to everything else. Diane Keaton's battle with dementia and Alzheimer's disease is now part of her legacy, alongside her iconic roles, her artistic contributions, and her impact on multiple generations of film lovers. It's a reminder that behind every public figure is a private person dealing with private struggles. It's a call to action for more research, more compassion, more support for the millions of people facing similar diagnoses. And it's a tribute to the strength required to keep going, to keep working, to keep living even when your own mind is becoming your enemy. Diane Keaton fought her battle with dignity. And now that the battle is over, we can remember her for all that she was, everything she gave us, and important conversations her story continues to inspire.